Jessica Harris had always been the kind of person who thrived on structure and order. As an architect, she spent her days designing homes and commercial buildings, ensuring every beam, every foundation, every intricate element was in perfect harmony with the whole. Her life had been much the same, carefully planned, precise, and meticulously executed. After spending years living in the heart of the city, she finally decided it was time to leave behind the chaos, the traffic, and the suffocating proximity of people she didn't want to interact with. She needed space, quiet, and the ability to breathe without feeling like the entire world was closing in around her. That was what led her to purchase the house on the outskirts of town, a beautiful property nestled on a hill, with a vast expanse of land stretching around it, ensuring privacy. It had been a project she took on with both professional and personal investment, restoring the century-old house to its former glory while making it her sanctuary. The house itself was a masterpiece, a blend of old-world charm and modern functionality. Jessica had spent months overseeing renovations, ensuring that the historical aspects were preserved while implementing the necessary upgrades to make it not only livable but ideal. The wide wraparound porch offered a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape, a thick forest on one side, rolling hills on the other, and in the distance, a pristine lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. It was the kind of place she had dreamed about while stuck in her high-rise apartment, listening to the constant blare of sirens and the never-ending chatter of life just outside her window. Here, there were no neighbors within earshot, no invasive streetlights polluting the night sky. It was exactly what she had wanted. Or so she thought. Jessica had never been particularly interested in forming close bonds with neighbors, but she had expected, at the very least, a mutual understanding of boundaries and respect for personal space. That expectation was shattered almost immediately after she moved in. The first time she met Karen Wilmore, she had been unloading furniture from a moving truck when a woman in her mid-40s waltzed up the gravel driveway uninvited. With her perfectly styled blonde hair, oversized sunglasses perched on her head, and an air of self-importance that was almost palpable, she had introduced herself with a smile that felt too wide, too rehearsed. "Jessica, I just had to come over and welcome you to the neighborhood," Karen had exclaimed, as if they were long-lost friends rather than strangers meeting for the first time. "I'm Karen, I live just down the road. Your house, oh my God, it's absolutely stunning. I've always thought this place had potential, and now that someone like you is living here, it's just, wow. Just wow." Jessica had thanked her politely, though something about the woman immediately set her on edge. Maybe it was the way Karen's eyes darted past her, surveying the property with an expression that wasn't just admiration, it was possessiveness, entitlement, as if she already had plans that extended far beyond a simple neighborly welcome. Jessica had brushed it off, assuming she was just one of those overly friendly types who thrived on small talk and suburban gossip. She wasn't interested in either. At first, the interactions had been nothing more than minor annoyances. Karen had an uncanny ability to appear whenever Jessica was outside, whether she was watering the plants, checking the mail, or simply enjoying her morning coffee on the porch. There was always an excuse, a casual wave, a passing comment about the weather, a forced compliment that inevitably turned into a suggestion about what Jessica should do with the house. "You know, with the right lighting, your backyard could be an absolute dream for sunset photography," Karen had mused one evening, leaning against the fence as if she belonged there. "I have an eye for these things. You should totally let me do a photo shoot here, just imagine the aesthetic." Jessica had declined as politely as possible, but Karen had a way of making refusals feel like personal attacks. She would laugh it off, but there was always something behind her eyes, an irritation barely concealed beneath the surface. Still, Jessica hadn't thought much of it. Some people just didn't understand boundaries. Then she started noticing things that made her uneasy. At first they were small, insignificant on their own. A slight shift in the way her garden furniture was arranged, as if someone had moved it an inch or two. The faint imprint of footsteps in the damp soil near her greenhouse when she hadn't been outside that day. A garden hose left partially uncoiled when she was certain she had wound it up the night before. She told herself she was imagining things, that she was being paranoid. After all, she had chosen to live in a secluded area, of course. There would be animals, the occasional trespasser from town taking a shortcut through the woods. It wasn't necessarily something sinister. But then, one morning while scrolling through social media, she saw it. A post from Karen's account, a picture of her backyard. Her backyard. The caption read, "Golden Hour Magic Dream Home Aesthetic Goals." Jessica stared at the image, her stomach twisting. It wasn't just taken from the road or the edge of her property. No, this was from inside her yard, near the pergola she had just finished staining last week. Her hands tightened around her phone. She hadn't given Karen permission to be on her property. She hadn't even been home at the time the picture was taken. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Karen had been inside her yard, wandering around, setting up a damn photo shoot like it was some public park she had a right to access. Jessica immediately went outside, checking her surroundings with a sharp gaze. Nothing seemed out of place, but the violation sat heavy in her chest. This wasn't just an annoying neighbor overstepping, this was trespassing. A blatant disregard for personal space. When she confronted Karen about it later that day, expecting some form of remorse or, at the very least, a sheepish apology, she got neither. "Oh, come on, Jessica," Karen had scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "It's not a big deal. I was just taking a few pictures, it's not like I touched anything. You weren't even home." Jessica's jaw tightened. "That's not the point, Karen. You don't come onto my property without my permission. Ever. Do you understand me?" For a brief moment, there was something in Karen's eyes that made Jessica uneasy. A flicker of something darker, something that didn't quite match the carefree persona she projected. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by an exaggerated roll of her eyes and a laugh that felt hollow. "Wow. Okay, relax. It won't happen again," Karen had said, though the way she smirked made Jessica doubt the sincerity of her words. And she was right to doubt them, because the next time it happened, it wasn't just Karen taking pictures. It was an entire production. Jessica came home one evening to find multiple cars parked along the road near her property. As she stepped out of her car, she could hear voices' laughter, the unmistakable click of a camera shutter. Her heart pounded as she rounded the corner of her house, only to be met with the sight of Karen and at least 3 other women posing in front of her pergola, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. There were ring lights, reflectors, a goddamn tripod. Jessica didn't hesitate. She didn't yell, didn't waste time arguing. She simply pulled out her phone and dialed the one person she knew would handle this the right way. "Mike," she said as soon as he picked up, "I need you to come over. Now." Jessica could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she stood frozen, staring at the absurd spectacle unfolding in her own backyard. Karen and her little entourage were moving around with the entitled grace of people who had convinced themselves they were doing absolutely nothing wrong. One woman, dressed in a flowing white sundress, twirled in slow motion while another crouched nearby, adjusting the angle of a ring light to capture the perfect golden hue of the setting sun. Karen, of course, stood at the center of it all, giving direction, tilting her head at different angles, changing poses every few seconds, exuding the smug confidence of someone who had never heard the word no in her life. The nerve of these people was staggering, but what was worse, what made Jessica's stomach tighten with something far deeper than anger, was the sheer audacity of it. This wasn't some innocent mistake or a harmless misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Karen knew exactly what she was doing. Jessica exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around her phone as she turned away from the ridiculous display and made the call. Mike answered on the second ring. She kept her voice level, but there was no mistaking the sharpness in her tone. "I need you to come over." Now there was a brief pause on the other end before his voice came through, steady and calm as always. "What's going on?" She turned back toward the yard, watching as one of the women perched herself on the edge of Jessica's wooden garden bench, running a hand through her hair in what she probably thought was an effortless, candid pose. "I have a situation. Karen and her friends are trespassing on my property. They brought lighting equipment, cameras, it's a full-on photo shoot." Another pause. Then a sigh. "Jesus Christ," Mike muttered. "I'm on my way. Don't engage them yet. Just stay inside and keep an eye on them. Jessica wasn't sure she could do that. Every rational part of her knew that staying out of it and letting Mike handle it was the best course of action, but every instinct in her body screamed at her to march into the yard and put an immediate stop to this insanity. However, she wasn't about to make the mistake of losing her temper and giving Karen exactly what she wanted: drama. So she gritted her teeth, shoved her phone into her pocket, and stepped back into the shadows of her porch, waiting. It took less than 10 minutes for Mike to arrive, but by then the situation had only escalated. Karen and her group had moved closer to the house, completely disregarding any illusion of boundaries. One of the women was now seated on Jessica's porch steps, scrolling through her phone between shots. Another had wandered over to the side of the house, snapping close-ups of the ivy-covered stone wall like she was curating content for some rustic lifestyle magazine. Karen herself was standing in the middle of the yard, adjusting the straps of her silk blouse, tossing her hair dramatically as she whispered something to her photographer. The arrogance was staggering. Jessica heard the low rumble of Mike's car before she saw him. The black sedan pulled up quietly, and he stepped out with the slow, deliberate movements of someone assessing a situation before making his next move. Dressed in plainclothes jeans and a dark gray button-down, he didn't immediately look like law enforcement, but the weight of his presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. Jessica could see it happen in real time, the way Karen's friends stiffened slightly, their movements becoming more hesitant, as if they could sense the shift in control. Karen, however, remained completely unfazed. Mike didn't say anything at first. He simply walked up the gravel path, his sharp gaze sweeping across the scene. Jessica saw his jaw tighten slightly as he took in the lighting equipment, the reflectors, the sheer audacity of what was happening. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "This is private property. You need to leave. Now." Karen turned, blinking as if she had just noticed him. Then, with a slow, infuriating smile, she placed a hand on her hip. "Oh, wow, is this really necessary?" she said, her voice dripping with exaggerated amusement. "We're just taking a few pictures. No harm done." Mike didn't flinch. "You're trespassing," he said evenly. "Which, last I checked, is a crime. So yes, it is necessary." Karen let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Come on, officer. Oh, wait, you are off duty, aren't you?" she added, tilting her head. "So technically, you're just a concerned citizen right now, just like the rest of us. No badge, no official authority. You can ask us to leave, but you can't make us." Jessica could practically feel the temperature drop. Karen thought she was clever, playing technicalities, acting as if she had some upper hand. What she always failed to understand was that her privilege and her attitude weren't shields against reality. Mike didn't argue. He simply pulled out his phone and made a single call. "Yeah, I need a unit out here for trespassing and property damage," he said, his voice neutral, businesslike. "Multiple individuals on site. They've been asked to leave, refusing to comply." Jessica watched as Karen's expression faltered, just for a second. It wasn't much, but it was enough to be satisfying. "Okay," Karen said, holding up her hands. "Let's not get crazy here. There's no damage." "That's not your call to make," Mike said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Police will be here in a few minutes. You can explain it to them." For the first time, genuine uncertainty flickered across Karen's face. One of her friends, probably realizing how badly this was going, whispered something to her, clearly urging her to de-escalate. Karen hesitated, her gaze flickering between Mike and Jessica, as if calculating how much trouble she could realistically get into. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, she rolled her eyes. "Fine. Whatever. We're leaving," she muttered, turning on her heel. "God, you people are so uptight." Jessica didn't say anything as she watched them gather their things, shoving cameras into bags, folding up their tripods with far less care than they had set them up. One woman muttered something under her breath as she passed Jessica, something that sounded suspiciously like psycho, but Jessica didn't flinch. She didn't care what they thought. By the time the last car pulled away, leaving only dust and tire tracks behind, Jessica let out a slow breath. Mike turned to her. I'll file a report just to have a record of this, he said. But knowing Karen, she's not going to let it go that easily. Jessica nodded. I know, and she did. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jessica had always believed that some people needed to learn their lessons the hard way. She had thought that after the police got involved, after Karen was forced to pack up her tripods and ring lights and scurry off her property like a petulant child caught in the act, that would be the end of it. But Karen wasn't just anyone. She wasn't the type to accept defeat, let alone acknowledge when she was in the wrong. No, Karen was the kind of person who thrived on pushing limits, testing boundaries, and manipulating situations until she came out looking like the victim. Jessica had seen it in her eyes, that flicker of anger barely concealed behind the fake laughter and performative eye rolls. For a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. Jessica wanted to believe Karen had finally gotten the message, but a part of her knew better. Karen was plotting, waiting, figuring out a way to turn the situation in her favor. It wasn't a matter of if she would retaliate, but when. The first sign came in the form of a letter in Jessica's mailbox, folded neatly into an unmarked envelope. She knew before she even opened it that it wasn't anything good. The paper was thick, the ink slightly smudged, as if it had been printed in a hurry. The wording was careful, but the message was clear. Karen was filing a formal complaint. Not with the police, but with the neighborhood board, claiming Jessica had harassed and intimidated a group of women conducting a peaceful creative project. She alleged that Jessica had created a hostile and unwelcoming environment, and most laughably, that she had used her personal connections with law enforcement to unfairly target and threaten residents. Jessica actually laughed out loud when she finished reading, shaking her head in disbelief. Karen was weaponizing bureaucracy against her, using technicalities and carefully chosen language to paint herself as the victim. It was a common tactic for people like her, privileged, manipulative, and completely incapable of taking responsibility for their actions. Still, Jessica wasn't worried. The complaint itself was ridiculous, and she knew it wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. The problem was, Karen didn't actually need to win. She just needed to make enough noise, stir up enough controversy, and get enough people to start doubting Jessica's side of the story. The second sign that things were escalating came 2 nights later. Jessica had just finished locking up for the evening, double-checking the doors, ensuring the security system was armed, when she caught something unusual on her security cameras. The live feed showed movement at the edge of her property, figures shifting in the darkness, barely more than shadows against the trees. Her stomach clenched as she leaned closer to the monitor, adjusting the brightness. There were 3 of them. Not Karen this time, these were men. They weren't doing anything yet. Just standing there, lingering, watching. One of them lifted a phone, the dim glow of the screen momentarily illuminating his face before he turned it away. They weren't casual passersby, they weren't lost. They were waiting for something. Jessica didn't panic, she wasn't that type of person. Instead, she did exactly what she had prepared for. She reached for her phone and dialed Mike. When he picked up, she didn't waste time. I have 3 unidentified men standing just outside my property line, she said. They're not moving, but they've been there for at least 5 minutes. Mike was silent for half a second before responding. You armed? Jessica exhaled. Yes, good, he said. I'm on my way. She didn't step outside, she knew better than that. Instead, she stayed where she was, watching the cameras, tracking their movements. They lingered a while longer, occasionally muttering to each other before one of them walked toward her fence. He ran a hand along the top, then tested the gate handle. It was locked, but the fact that he even tried made Jessica's stomach churn with rage. Before he could do anything else, headlights cut through the darkness. Mike's car came to a sharp stop on the gravel, and just like that, the men scattered. They knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't amateurs, and they weren't going to stick around long enough to get caught. By the time Mike got out of the car, they were gone. Damn it, he muttered, scanning the tree line. They were testing you. Jessica's jaw tightened. I figured. Mike turned to look at her. You think Karen's involved? Jessica didn't hesitate. I know she is. The next day, Jessica checked her security footage again, looking for anything she might have missed. That's when she saw one of the men, the one who had touched her gate, had something in his hand. He wasn't just testing the lock. He had been placing something on her fence. Jessica immediately went outside to check. It didn't take long to find it. A small, thin tracking device was hidden beneath the wooden frame, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. She pulled it off carefully, turning it over in her hands. It was active. Someone was tracking her movements. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just Karen being an entitled brat anymore. This was someone trying to gain access to her property in a very real, very dangerous way. She took the device inside and set it on the counter, staring at it like it was a ticking time bomb. Then, without another second of hesitation, she called Mike again. "I found a tracker on my fence," she said, her voice deadly calm. Mike cursed under his breath. "I'm coming over." When he arrived, he examined the device, turning it over in his hands with a grim expression. "This isn't just some cheap GPS tag," he muttered. "This is high-end." Jessica crossed her arms. What are the chances Karen knows how to use something like this? Mike sighed. 0. But that doesn't mean she's not involved. Maybe she mentioned something to the wrong person. Maybe she was bragging about how you deserve to be messed with either way. This is serious. Jessica didn't need to be told that. They filed an official report that night. Mike took the tracker with him for further investigation. Jessica hired a professional to sweep her entire property for other devices. She wasn't taking any chances. And then, just when she thought things couldn't get any worse, she received a message. A text from an unknown number. "I see you. You can't hide forever." Jessica stared at the screen, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was bigger. This was personal. And whoever was behind it wasn't done with her yet. Jessica sat at her kitchen table, staring at the text message on her phone, her pulse thudding in her ears. The words were simple but chilling. "I see you. You can't hide forever." The logical part of her brain knew that this was meant to intimidate her, that whoever had sent it wanted her to feel watched, vulnerable, afraid. But Jessica wasn't the type to scare easily. She had always prided herself on being rational, calculating, able to assess risks and act accordingly. That's what made her a good architect. She knew how to build something strong, something that could withstand pressure, force, even time itself. But now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was the one being torn down, brick by brick, by someone who was watching her, waiting for her to crack. She needed to think. Every decision she made from this point forward had to be precise, controlled, strategic. She knew two things for certain. First, that Karen had escalated the situation far beyond some petty feud, even if she didn't fully realize what she had set into motion. And second, that Jessica was being targeted by someone who was methodical, someone who wasn't just looking to intimidate her but was actively planning something. Mike had taken the tracking device with him to analyze, but Jessica wasn't about to sit around and wait for answers. She needed to take action, not just defensively but proactively. She grabbed her laptop and began digging. The first thing she did was check Karen's social media. It was a goldmine of self-indulgence, as expected glossy, filtered photos of her with her carefully curated aesthetics, captions designed to make it look like she was living the perfect life. But Jessica wasn't interested in the surface. She was looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might give her a clue as to who Karen had been talking to lately. And then she found it. 2 weeks ago, around the same time Karen had first started her ridiculous antics on Jessica's property, she had posted a story, a quick, casual video of her sitting in a coffee shop, laughing at something off camera. The caption read, "Planning something big. Stay tuned." Game changer, but it wasn't Karen's smug, self-satisfied expression that caught Jessica's attention. It was the reflection in the window behind her. There was a man sitting at the next table, just barely visible in the frame. Tall, broad shoulders, dark jacket, head tilted slightly down as if he were looking at something in his hands. Jessica wouldn't have thought anything of it, except for one thing: she recognized the jacket. She had seen it on one of the men who had been standing outside her property the other night. Her stomach twisted. Karen had met with them. She might not have known exactly who they were, or maybe she had just been showing off, bragging about how she was getting under Jessica's skin, but the connection was undeniable. Jessica took a screenshot and sent it to Mike immediately. "Do you recognize this guy?" His response was almost instant. "Don't move. I'm coming over." By the time Mike arrived, Jessica had already locked every door and window in the house and armed the security system. She let him in, her expression tight as she handed him the phone. He studied the image carefully before muttering a curse under his breath. "His name is Carter Rains," he said finally. "He's a fixer. Not a hitman, not someone who leaves bodies behind, but someone who specializes in intimidation, break-ins, making people feel unsafe until they give up whatever it is he's been paid to make them give up." Jessica's fingers curled into fists, and Karen just casually had coffee with him. Mike exhaled. Maybe she didn't know who he was, or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing. He glanced at Jessica. "Either way, this isn't just about you and Karen anymore. This is organized." Jessica had already suspected as much, but hearing Mike confirm it sent a sharp wave of anger through her. She wasn't just dealing with some bored influencer trying to boost her engagement. This was a deliberate campaign to make her feel unsafe, and she wasn't about to sit back and let it happen. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from Mike. "Then we have to hit back. What's our next move?" Mike studied her for a moment before nodding slightly, as if coming to a decision. "We need to bait them out. Make them think they're winning. If Rains is involved, that means someone hired him. We just need to figure out what they want." Jessica took a slow breath, letting the idea settle. It was dangerous, but she also knew that if she didn't take control of the situation now, it would only get worse. "Fine," she said finally. "Then let's give them something to chase." Over the next 24 hours, Jessica and Mike constructed a plan. It was simple but effective. Jessica would make it seem like she was rattled, like she was preparing to leave town, listing her house as a possible sale, making inquiries about security firms, even making calls to a lawyer about potential property disputes. They would leak just enough information through the right channels to make Karen or whoever was pulling the strings believe that Jessica was on the verge of giving up. And then they would wait. The response came faster than either of them had expected. The very next night, Jessica's security system detected a breach. Not just people lurking at the fence this time. Someone had actually attempted to disable the cameras. Jessica's heart pounded as she watched the footage. The intruder was careful, moving with precision, clearly experienced. And that's when she knew this wasn't just about harassment. This was a setup. She grabbed her phone and called Mike. "They just made their move," she said. Mike was already on his way. The moment he arrived, they reviewed the footage together. "They're getting impatient," Mike muttered. "They're pushing harder because they think you're cracking." Jessica exhaled. "Then we have to hit back. Hard." Mike nodded slowly. "Yeah, and I think I know exactly how to do it." That night, Jessica made her own move. She baited them further, letting Karen overhear a conversation one she had staged about how she was considering selling the house sooner rather than later. And just as they had hoped, Karen took the bait. The very next morning, Jessica received a new offer on her home. Anonymously submitted. No name, no contact information, just a ridiculously high sum of money for a house that wasn't even officially on the market yet. Jessica stared at the email, then looked up at Mike. "They're trying to buy me out," she murmured. Mike smirked, but there was no humor in his expression. "Yeah," he said, "which means we just found out what they want." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Now we just have to find out why." Jessica sat at her desk, staring at the email on her screen. The offer was absurdly high, far beyond what her house was worth, and yet there was no attached name, no contact details, no explanation. Just a number. An obscene, calculated number meant to do one thing, push her toward accepting without question. But Jessica wasn't stupid, and she certainly wasn't desperate. This was never about real estate. This was about control. Someone wanted her gone, and they were willing to escalate from harassment to intimidation to outright bribery. And the worst part? Karen was in the middle of it. Whether she was an active player or just a pawn, Jessica wasn't sure yet, But one thing was undeniable: Karen had led these people straight to her. Mike leaned over her shoulder, scanning the email, his jaw tightening as he exhaled through his nose. "They're getting sloppy," he muttered. "They think they've shaken you enough to make you run." Jessica turned to face him, arms crossed. "Yeah? Well, they're about to learn how wrong they are." Mike sat down across from her, rubbing the back of his neck. "We need to find out who's behind this. The only way they'd drop an offer like this is if they think there's something here worth the trouble." Jessica thought about that for a moment. What if it's not just about the house? Mike raised an eyebrow. "Go on." She pulled up the old property records on her laptop. This house was originally built over 100 years ago, but in the last 50 years, it changed hands a lot. People bought it, owned it for a year or two, then sold it. No one stayed for long. "That's weird, right?" Mike leaned in, his focus sharpening. "Yeah, and if someone wants to push you out now, that means whatever's happening here isn't over." Jessica clicked through the records, looking for patterns. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold. "Oh my God." Mike's gaze snapped to her face. "What?" Jessica turned the screen toward him. Every single previous owner, every one of them sold the house to the same buyer under different company names. All those sales? They weren't random. Someone's been reacquiring this property over and over again for decades. Mike cursed under his breath. They've been collecting it. But for what? Jessica sat back, shaking her head. "That's what we need to find out." But they didn't have to look far. That night, the real escalation began. At 2:17 a.m., Jessica's security system blared through the house. She jolted awake, her heart slamming against her ribs, and instinctively grabbed the pistol she kept in her nightstand. The cameras were already pulled up on her phone before she even got out of bed. There were 3 men on her property. They weren't just lurking this time. They were inside the fence, moving with coordinated efficiency, one of them disabling her motion lights, while the other 2 made their way toward her back door. Jessica's blood turned ice cold. She wasn't alone this time. Mike had insisted on staying over, knowing things were escalating too fast, and now she was infinitely grateful for that decision. She bolted out of bed, adrenaline spiking, and found him already moving. 3 of them, she whispered, keeping her voice low. "They're coming to the back." Mike nodded, grabbing his gun from the table. "They're not here to scare you anymore," he murmured. "They're here to finish this." Jessica's grip tightened around her weapon. "Then let's welcome them properly." She flicked off the safety, adrenaline coursing through her veins, and positioned herself near the kitchen doorway while Mike moved toward the back entrance. The men outside weren't being reckless. They weren't kicking down doors or smashing windows. They were testing, checking locks, looking for an easy way in. That scared her more than if they'd been aggressive. It meant they were professionals. It meant they weren't in a hurry. Mike moved first. He threw open the back door so fast it startled them, stepping out with his gun drawn. "Don't move," he barked, his voice carrying that unmistakable authority of law enforcement. "Hands where I can see them." For a moment, Jessica thought they might comply. One of the men actually raised his hand slightly, his stance uncertain. But the second man reacted fast, grabbing something from his waistband, a knife. Not a gun, but still deadly. Mike didn't hesitate. He fired once, hitting the man's leg. He crumpled instantly, cursing in pain, while the other 2 bolted toward the trees, vanishing into the dark. Jessica sprinted forward, gun still raised, heart hammering. The injured man was already pressing a hand to his bleeding leg, his teeth gritted in pain, but he wasn't talking. Mike kicked the knife out of his reach. "Who sent you?" Silence. Mike crouched beside him, his voice dangerously low. "I suggest you start talking. Because right now the only thing keeping you out of a worse situation is me." Jessica scanned the darkness, her nerves on fire, knowing the other 2 were still out there. But she kept her gun steady, her breathing controlled. This wasn't over. Not yet. It took 5 minutes for the police to arrive. 5 agonizing minutes where Jessica half expected the others to return with reinforcements. But they didn't. They were too smart for that. This was a warning, not a final move. The injured man was taken into custody, but Jessica knew he wouldn't talk. The people behind this were too careful, too calculated. But now they had crossed a line. Mike turned to Jessica, his expression unreadable. "We just changed the game," he said quietly. Jessica clenched her jaw. "Good. I was tired of playing defense." The next morning, she woke to another email. No text this time, no attempt at persuasion, just a single number. The offer had doubled. She exhaled sharply, closing the laptop with a quiet click. "They're getting desperate," Mike muttered. Jessica met his gaze, her resolve like steel. "Then it's time to hit back." Jessica stared at the doubled offer on her screen, fingers resting motionless on the edge of the laptop. They were trying to end this. No more waiting, no more slow intimidation tactics. Whoever was behind this wanted her gone now, and they were willing to pay any price to make it happen. It wasn't just desperation, it was certainty. They had pushed her as far as they thought she could go, and now they expected her to take the bait, to pack her things and disappear like all the others before her. But that was the thing about pushing people too hard. Sometimes instead of running, they dug in their heels. Mike had stayed overnight, refusing to leave her alone after the break-in. Now he stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes narrowed at the screen. They wouldn't double the offer unless they thought they were running out of options. That means we're close to something. Jessica exhaled slowly, her mind racing. "I want to know what's here, what's underneath all of this. Because it's not just about the house. It never was." Mike nodded. "Then we stopped playing by their rules. We forced their hand." She turned to face him. "How?" He hesitated for only a second before answering. "We make it look like you're leaving." Jessica knew what he meant. They would fake her compliance, act like she was finally breaking under pressure. She would list the house, start moving things out in a way that was visible, give them just enough reason to believe she was about to sign that contract. And when they thought they had won, when they finally let their guard down, she and Mike would be watching, waiting for them to show themselves. It was risky, but the truth was, staying still was more dangerous than making a move. The next morning, Jessica made sure Karen saw her on the phone, loudly discussing real estate listings. She let Karen overhear a conversation at the cafe in town about how it wasn't worth the fight anymore. She even had a moving company drop off boxes, stacking them just inside her garage where they were clearly visible from the street. She could feel Karen watching, hovering in that way she always did when she thought she had the upper hand. But Jessica didn't engage. She let Karen believe whatever she wanted. 2 days later, it happened. Jessica's security cameras caught a black SUV pulling up to the house just after midnight. The same vehicle had been circling the area for days, never stopping long enough to be obvious, but never fully disappearing either. This time, the passenger door opened, and a man stepped out. It was him. Carter Rains. Mike had warned her that if Rains showed up personally, it meant things were about to escalate beyond anything they had dealt with before. He wasn't just here to observe anymore. He was here to finish it. Jessica's heart pounded as she watched the monitor. Rains didn't approach the house right away. He stood by the SUV, looking around, scanning the area like he was waiting for something. Then he pulled out a phone. Jessica's own phone vibrated a second later. Unknown number. She didn't answer. But a message followed immediately. "This is your last chance. You sign or we make this personal." Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She turned to Mike, who was already on the phone, speaking in a low, controlled voice. "Yeah, it's him. Confirmed. No, don't move yet. We need him to think he's got time." He hung up, meeting Jessica's gaze. "We're almost there. But we need more." Jessica's mind worked quickly. He's waiting for something. If they wanted to burn the house down or force their way in, they would have done it already. They need me to sign. Mike nodded. They want it legal. Whatever they're after, they need a clean title transfer. No lawsuits. No loose ends. Jessica turned back to the screen, watching Rains as he paced near the SUV. And then, almost too fast to process, he looked directly at the camera. She froze. He knew. Before she could react, before she could even process what was happening, the power went out. The entire house plunged into darkness, the security system shutting down in an instant. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The camera's offline. The light's dead. Mike swore under his breath. Backup generator. Now. Jessica didn't hesitate. She sprinted for the garage, fumbling in the dark until her hands found the switch. She flipped it, and with a mechanical hum, the emergency lights flickered to life. The cameras came back a second later, and when she turned to look at the screen, Rains was gone. Her pulse pounded. They're moving. Mike grabbed his gun. Stay here. She didn't argue. She wasn't a cop. She wasn't armed for a full confrontation. But she wasn't going to be useless either. Jessica pulled out her phone, dialing the emergency contact Mike had given her, the team that had been waiting for this moment. They're here, she said. Now. The response was immediate. Units en route. Stay inside. Do not engage. Minutes passed like hours. Jessica could hear movement outside, footsteps crunching against gravel, then gunfire. One shot. Then another. Her stomach twisted, and she gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. And then silence. She barely breathed as the radio on Mike's vest crackled to life. 1 in custody. 2 fled. Area secured. Jessica let out a shaky exhale, her heart still racing. Mike stepped back inside a moment later, his expression tight. They were cutting the main line, had a second vehicle waiting down the road. But we got Rains. Jessica swallowed hard. And the others? Mike shook his head. Gone. But they won't get far. Jessica stared at him, then at the house around her, at the shattered sense of security she had once felt here. This isn't over, is it? Mike hesitated. Not yet. But we just forced their hand. And now they're on the run. She nodded slowly, knowing that while this fight might not be over, she had made one thing very, very clear. She wasn't going anywhere. Jessica sat on her porch, the first rays of morning light stretching across the damp grass, illuminating the damage from the night before. The power had been restored, but the tension in the air remained. The fight hadn't ended just because Carter Rains had been arrested. If anything, it had only confirmed what she and Mike had suspected all along. Whoever was behind this wasn't just some random buyer with too much money and a stubborn desire to own this house. This was something far bigger. Something methodical. People didn't hire fixers, send armed men to trespass on private property, and double their offers overnight unless they had a lot to lose. And now Jessica was sure of one thing. This was never about real estate. Mike had barely slept. He stood near the railing, speaking in low, clipped tones to someone on the phone, his posture rigid. Jessica knew the police were working on tracking down the other 2 men who had fled, but she wasn't naive enough to think they'd be caught anytime soon. The kind of people who hired men like Rains didn't leave loose ends. They cut them off. Permanently. When Mike finally hung up, he turned to Jessica, his face unreadable. Rains isn't talking, he said. Not yet, anyway. He knows he's in deep, but he also knows he's more valuable alive than dead to whoever hired him. They'll try to make him disappear before he can tell us anything useful. Jessica tightened her grip around her coffee mug, the warmth doing little to ease the cold feeling in her chest. So what do we do? Mike hesitated, then exhaled. We push harder. I pulled some strings. We've got a lead on where some of these shell companies buying up property are registered. Turns out they all trace back to a single offshore account. Jessica's eyebrows lifted slightly. And let me guess, it's untraceable. Not exactly, Mike said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Someone got sloppy. There's a connection between these purchases and a real estate development firm out of New York. On the surface, it looks legit. But if you dig a little deeper, it's tied to high-profile land acquisitions with a history of pushing people out through. Unconventional methods. Jessica narrowed her eyes. So this is a pattern. Not just me. Mike nodded. Exactly. And here's the kicker, one of the lead investors in this firm used to be married to a guy who was involved in lobbying efforts to privatize land for commercial use. High-rise condos. Shopping districts. The usual game. But they don't buy land the normal way. They force people out. Quietly. No paper trails, no lawsuits. They make it so difficult for owners to stay that selling is the only option. Jessica exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. It all made sense now. The absurdly high offers, the harassment, the break-ins. They didn't just want her to sell, they needed her to sell, and she had screwed up their entire plan by refusing. "So what happens next?" she asked, glancing at Mike. "We put the pressure on," he said. "We go public with this. The moment the media starts digging, these people will scramble. They rely on anonymity. The second their names get attached to this, they'll start covering their tracks, pulling out of deals, cutting ties with the fixers they hired. We make it clear that if anything happens to you, we know exactly who to look at." Jessica hesitated. She had never wanted to be the center of a public spectacle. She had built her life around privacy, around control over her own space. But this wasn't just about her anymore. If she let them win, if she left, then the cycle would continue. They'd find another target. Another house. Another owner who wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. She straightened her shoulders, nodding once. "Then let's burn this whole thing to the ground." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. Jessica and Mike compiled everything: property records, financial trails, the attempted break-ins, the tracker they had found, even Karen's connection to the whole mess. A contact of Mike's at a major news outlet took immediate interest, and within hours reporters were making calls, digging into the real owners of the companies behind the land acquisitions. The more they uncovered, the uglier it got. Karen, of course, tried to save herself the moment the story broke. She went on social media, claiming she had no idea that the people she had been involved with were criminals. She played the victim, insisting she had been misled, and that she had simply been excited about a business opportunity, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Her name was attached to it now, and as Jessica expected, the people who had used her as a pawn immediately cut her loose. The fallout was swift. Within a week, 2 of the shell companies shut down completely. The real estate firm quietly pulled out of every pending deal in the area. The police were still working on tracking down the men who had fled, but the moment their employers started folding, they disappeared. Rains, still in custody, suddenly found himself abandoned, no high-powered lawyers swooping in to rescue him, no backdoor deals being made. Just a man who had been left behind, and when that reality set in, he started talking. By the time the dust settled, Jessica had won. She kept her house. She stayed exactly where she was. The threats stopped. The pressure was gone, and when she walked out onto her property now, she no longer felt like she was being watched. But the experience had changed her. She was smarter now, more cautious. She reinforced her security, installed new cameras, strengthened her connections within law enforcement. Because she knew that even though this battle was over, there would always be people out there who thought they could take whatever they wanted. She wasn't naive. She just wasn't scared anymore. The last time she saw Karen, it was from a distance. The woman looked smaller somehow, stripped of the arrogance she had once worn like armor. She wasn't in the neighborhood anymore. Her home had been listed for sale almost immediately after the scandal broke. The social media posts had stopped. The followers had turned on her. Whatever version of influence Karen had once wielded was gone now, reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. Jessica watched as Karen loaded the last of her things into a moving van, but she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, just a quiet certainty that this was how it was always meant to end. Karen had spent her life believing that rules didn't apply to her, that she could manipulate and twist situations to her advantage, bend people's will, push boundaries until she got what she wanted. But she had finally learned. Some lines shouldn't be crossed. And Jessica Harris was never going to be someone else's pawn.